So you good to go now?
Yeah, I should be.
Alright, cool.
I should be.
So yeah, I had this debate with you because you had your video where you were talking about how you used to be an Ancap and why you are no longer an Ancap, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So I think you want to start with some criticisms, or do you want me to get us involved?
Yeah, so I saw some of the things that you said. They were probably just minor comments that you said on the vids to respond to channel in your Discord. You had mentioned that I misunderstood property or had some misunderstanding about what property was. And you had also mentioned that I was making rather bold claims about all ANCAPs and sort of saying that what I believed is necessarily entailed by to be believed by all other ANCAPs.
Yeah, so I suppose on the misunderstanding property point, basically the entire purpose of property is to resolve conflicts over scarce means, right? It doesn't make sense to talk about property if you're not talking about conflicts, right? Because it's right
Yeah.
now I am drinking out of this mug I'm drinking some tea right now, right? And if you came over and you said,
Mhm.
no, I want to use the mug for something different than that, and I'd be like, well, I want to use it to keep drinking though. We have a conflict over the use of this mug. So the way you
Mhm.
solve this is by saying, right, okay, who owns the mug? And moreover, whoever is in the right there, whoever wins out in that conflict justly, they are the owner. They're defined as the owner. It's all about conflict avoidance. You can't really just, because you had this whole diagram in your video where it's like, okay, there's capitalist property and then there's these other types of property. But it's like, no, it's all
Yeah.
property. If it's not solving conflict, it's not property.
Okay, so you don't really make distinctions between different kinds of property. You just kind of see it all as, you know, property if it facilitates that certain function. I guess I can see that perspective, but would you not, as an anarcho-capitalist, part of your ideology, or at least in some aspect, part of what you believe, would entail one type of property over another?
Well, basically, what anarcho-capitalism is, the anarchism is adherence to natural law, and the capitalism is with reference to Austrian economics. And like, so the natural law property is all contained within that natural law framework. So it depends. So yes, to be an anarcho-capitalist, you'd have to have a specific theory of natural law, namely Rothbardian natural law theory. You could have, there were earlier natural law theories, but really Rothbardian natural law theory is the most advanced version of natural law because it actually takes into account conflict avoidance right from the get-go, and it derives everything based on conflict avoidance, which is an objective
Yeah,
standard
but
for property.
conflict avoidance as an objective standard for property, I don't know if you can draw a line directly from that to any one type of property.
Well, you absolutely can,
Right.
because you can derive, like, that's the whole point of Rothbardian natural law, is you're actually deriving directly from the axiom of conflict avoidance, you derive out what is necessitated by that. So let's just do the NEP real quick. So if we're going to be avoiding conflict, we would have to be outlawing the negation of conflict avoidance, which is conflict initiation, and we define conflict initiation as aggression. So that's how we get to the non-aggression principle as being objective within this framework of natural law.
Yeah, but you would have to. I guess I have a problem with that insofar as, in order to have aggression in the way that we typically mean it, between you and me and many others, we would have to presuppose some property, because aggression can't only be against a person; it has to be against them and their property, right? And if we can't use that to establish the property initially,
Well,
right?
we can do I'll do the homesteading principle then, because that's how you acquire property, right? So let's say Crusoe is, he finds a stick in nature. Nobody's touched the stick before. Nobody owns the stick yet, right? He takes this stick and then he sharpens it up and he's going to start using it for spearfishing. But then Friday comes along and he says, actually, I want to use that stick for stoking my fire, right? So how do we figure out who owns it, right? Well, we go to the homestead principle, right? If they were to have a conflict over this, it's clear that Friday must have initiated the conflict because the causal chain only has it be property when Crusoe makes it into property. It's, it's Friday who is the one who is initiating it, and this is, you can abstract this just A and B having a conflict over X. It must be the first user, the first comer to that property, who has the property right over it, because any latecomers are going to be initiating the conflicts when conflicts arise. So that's how you get to homesteading, and property is just a word for who is the who's the person who should be winning out in a conflict.
Yes, that's one perspective on property, and one perspective on a homesteading principle. But again, we see in the world around us in history, there are all different types of property. There are all different ways of understanding what one has a right to and what one does not have a right to. It's not just as simple as that. So, for example, I can concede that, sure, but homesteading principle works. You take the stick initially, you claim it. Let's say something like you mix your labor with the stick. I don't know. It's yours. But we can say that that's conditional. If you use the stick to hit someone else, you lose the right to the stick, or something like that. Or if you use it in a particular way, your right to the stick is no longer valid, or if multiple people use the stick or something like that. And I don't see why one would be more justified than the other from a purely logical standpoint. I mean, I can inject morality into this, and say that some understanding of property will be better than the other, but without doing that, um, there's nothing in themselves that tells us which is the correct type of property.
Like the issue with your theory here, where you're saying, well, let's just say that, well, you're allowed to use a stick only for certain things. You can't just say that. How are you deriving that from the purpose of property, which is conflict avoidance, dealing with these conflicts?
Well, sometimes there are unforeseen entailments, not logical entailments, but just, I guess, descriptive entailments from the environment or whatever, society, that we don't initially know when we set up the property rules, so that conflict can actually be created by certain types of property. This is famous from feudalism or slavery. These are types of property that create conflict because there's antagonisms.
But that's the point. To talk about conflict, you need to talk about property. So it can't be that property creates the conflict when the slave owner is claiming that he owns the slave. He doesn't actually own the slave because the slave owns themselves. So he is wrong
That's
in
a
that claim over the
yes,
property. He doesn't
in
have the
your
property right.
perspective. But if you were talking to a socialist, they would say that your claim of private property is equally as invalid,
So then I would ask them
right?
to derive that from conflict avoidance. How do you get there from the fact of conflict avoidance?
Well, you avoid the conflict between laborers and employers,
I mean,
right?
let's look at a specific example here then. So, what is the specific conflict you're talking about between some laborers and some
Well,
employers?
it's a conflict of interest,
No, I'm talking about conflicts
right?
as scarce means, right? When we both want to implement the same means towards contradictory ends. Like with Crusoe and Friday, one wants to use it for spearfishing, the other wants to use it for stoking their fire, right?
Well, yeah, I mean that it's kind of similar to that. I mean the capitalist wants to gain a profit, and the worker wants to maintain the value they produce
Well, no,
in the
that's false.
workplace.
They both act in order to gain profit. Everybody acts for profit,
Everybody
and they
acts
both gain a
for
profit because they both agreed to that trade, so they both necessarily profited.
they both reaped something from the relationship.
Yeah, and that, we call
But
that
I
profit.
think it would be silly. I'm sorry if I think I don't agree with the idea that that there is no antagonism or conflict in capitalism simply because of the initial agreement, when we can observe manifestations of conflict, such as, a strike
Right.
or,
I don't
uh,
think you're understanding what I mean by the word conflict. I not just mean where people are angry at each other or where they don't like each other or anything like that.
well,
It's a very specific thing. A conflict over scarce means is when two people are trying to implement that same means towards contradictory ends. Two or more, I should say.
well, yeah, there's only a finite number of say means of production in
Not means of
existence.
production, means in the praxeologic sense, where if I am using a stick to get coconuts off a tree, I'm implementing that stick as a means towards the end of getting coconuts off the tree.
Is there another way you can illustrate the difference between what I mean? Because I have this idea in my head of one person possesses the stick and the other wishes to use the stick in some way, and that would be a conflict because they don't wish them to use the stick. It's
It's
theirs.
it's not just the wish; it's the actual trying to implement it as a means towards a contradictory end. So Friday is trying to implement that stick that Crusoe is implementing toward the end of spearfishing. He tries to implement it toward the end of stoking a fire, right? And they can't both occur at the same time. So they're contradictory ends. Only one can go ahead. So that's a conflict.
Yeah, well, there's always these types of conflicts in any system of property. If I
And the property system is
decide to,
designed to avoid these conflicts. That's the point
yes,
of property.
ideally, I mean, I would agree to a certain extent. You should have a system of property that makes it so that um, there are the least amount of instances where you're going to get these types of conflicts. I would fully agree with that. I don't necessarily think that that manifests itself in capitalism,
Well, I don't know what you
but
mean by capitalism. It manifests
uh,
itself in Rothbardian natural law because you derive everything from conflict avoidance, so it necessarily entails everything about Rothbardian natural law. Right? Because if the purpose of property is to avoid conflict, right? So we have conflict avoidance. That's our top premise, right? And we want to see what does conflict avoidance imply. Well, it implies that the non-aggression principle, right? Because that would be the initiation of conflict cannot be allowed under conflict avoidance because it's the negation of conflict avoidance. So we have the NAP, and I derived for you before homesteading. All number of things can be derived. Forestalling, fucking all sorts.
yeah, I think there's an issue that we're having an impasse here, and it's that this sort of wanting to use the stick or using the stick. Was that the distinction that you made? Was actually using the stick, whereas
Actually,
wanting to use the
actually,
stick?
actually implementing it as a means towards the end, right? So I might want to have sex with a woman, but unless I actually try to implement her body towards that end while she doesn't want to, it's not rape. It's just me wanting something. I'm just coveting it.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. But I mean, there are these types of conflicts in capitalism all the time, or in any system of property. The system of property would just say who has the just right to decide how something's used and abused. And I'm saying that I may simply disagree with you or disagree with capitalism based on who I think should have those rights and who I think should not.
I mean, it's all well and good to
Right.
disagree, but how are you deriving that? Because I derived mine from conflict avoidance, and we agree that purpose of property is conflict avoidance. So I mean, you can't just arbitrarily say, I think that guy wins out in the conflict. I think that guy, because then you're not doing conflict avoidance. That's not a proper system of property.
Uh, I I don't see why my reason for choosing one type of property over another. If I say that I think that in my understanding of property, my chosen perspective on property in particular will result in sort of like less of this conflict, so to speak. I don't exactly know what you precisely mean by that. Maybe that's just me, but um,
All right. So
wouldn't that make it um, that would make it necessarily entail by your position? But if my position is anti-capitalist, that would make your position also anti-capitalist. So there's some further disagreement here.
okay. But your position is anti-property if you think, because property isn't something we can just sit down and decide willy-nilly. It's not an arbitrary thing, because we agreed the point of property is conflict avoidance. So we can objectively see what property system would avoid conflict, what the correct property system is, in another word. It's not just, I'm not just deciding that that the non-aggression principle holds. I didn't just decide that. I derived it from conflict avoidance. Do you see the difference there?
No, I'm still struggling with something. Um, yeah, I don't really get what it is you're saying. Well, where is the wrong in me saying that I have a certain set of values? Because this is from my point of view, this is what I do. I have a certain set of values, and one of those does involve conflict avoidance. There are also other ones, such as like autonomy, stuff like that, general well-being. Um, and I look at property and I say, is this system of property helping facilitate that, or is it not? And if it's not, how can I think of it differently to facilitate that? Where's the wrong in that?
Well, there's nothing wrong there because that's what I'm doing as well. I'm saying, right, let's look at which property system actually avoids conflict and which ones don't. So we can determine which property system is correct in that manner, right? Because if we have some hypothetical theory of property where it says that latecomers are the ones who actually have the property right, well, we can determine that that is objectively a false theory of property because it doesn't avoid conflict, which is the purpose
How
of
does it
property.
not avoid conflict?
Well, because the latecomers are the ones who are initiating the conflict, and this hypothetical theory of property is saying that they're fine in their initiation of conflict, which is the negation of conflict avoidance. So this is an objectively false theory of property.
Well, to do that, you need to presuppose the property,
No, you
right?
don't. Like, because
How would you not?
this property, the theory of property is assigning who has property rights over what, right? That's the point of the theory of property. So this hypothetical theory of property is assigning that latecomers rather than the firstcomers are the ones who have the property right over something when there's a conflict. But this is
Mhm.
objectively not avoiding conflict. Every time a conflict is initiated, the latecomer is the one who's initiating conflict, and they're being given the property right. They're being assigned the property. I didn't assume any property there. I just said, right, the first comer is implementing something as a means, and then a latecomer comes and tries to implement towards a separate means. Well, let's assign that the latecomer has the property right. But this is an objectively false theory of property because this is not conflict avoiding.
It's not conflict avoiding. And by conflict, you mean they use it. Okay.
By
And
conflict, I
it's,
mean when multiple people are trying to implement the same scarce means towards contradictory ends. So, like with the
yeah,
stick, they're both, one of them's trying to use it for spearfishing, one of them's trying to use it to stoke a fire, and they can't both do it at the same time. The stick ain't big enough, right? If So, there's a conflict over the use of that stick.
yeah, I see that. I understand that now. But I don't see how it's an invalid form of property because the maybe this belies something that I'm misunderstanding, but in order for them to be um, sort of using the property in that way that you described, in a way that transgresses on their initial property right, is to presuppose a system of property where they have that right. And if the property system does not consider that they have that right when newcomers come in a specific way, then they haven't done that.
Well, no, I'm not presupposing property. I'm saying that the property theory, the theory of property that you hold, is assigning who has the property right in a given conflict. Right? It's not saying that I'm not presupposing who has the property right. I'm saying, right, let's figure out who has the property right. Given the fact that there is this conflict over this scarce means, let's see which one has the property right and which one doesn't.
Yes, but you're doing that through, you have some methodology of doing that. And I'm saying that it almost sounds like, I could be wrong about this. I stand corrected, to be corrected. But that in that methodology of finding out who is assigned ownership, you have to presuppose the property form.
I mean, how am I presupposing anything when I'm determining it? Right, so
Because it's part of the methodology that you use.
My methodology is logic. I'm just looking at the logical necessity of who has initiated the conflict. I derived for you the non-aggression principle before, so whoever is the aggressor doesn't have the property right.
But aggression has to be defined with respect to some form of property.
No, it doesn't. You derive the property.
If you don't define aggression with respect or regarding some type of property, then no one could hold anything outside of themselves.
How is that the
as
case?
Property. Because aggression against a person, like i.e. me, pointing a gun at someone and saying, do this, that, the other thing, or, pushing them or punching them in some way, that is aggression against them. We'd consider that involuntary on their behalf. But if I go to, say, a like wall near them and punch the wall or shoot the wall, that is an aggression against them. And so,
it might be.
therefore, if it's their property.
No,
right?
not. I'm not saying if it's their property. We can determine whether it's their property, right? So if they wanted to use the wall in a way which was contradictory to you shooting it, they wanted the wall to not be shot. You want the wall to be shot. You're both trying to use the wall at the same time to contradictory ends. Then we go, okay, right. Who has the property right here? Let's figure out who has the property right. If they were using the wall first, then they were the first comer, so they have the property right because you initiate the conflict.
Where does that principle come from? That whoever uses it first has an indefinite right?
Okay, I derived it for you earlier, the Homestead principle.
Yes, and the first thing that I said in reference to that is that in most cases I could accept that, but you could also put further stipulations onto that, and there'd be no logical problem.
No, there would be logical problems because you can't. I'm not just deciding that the Homestead principle, applies. I determined it by looking at the first principle of conflict avoidance. Let's see what we can derive from this. We derived the Homestead principle. You can't just tack on extra little bits that you want for fucking arbitrarily, unless you derive them. I'm not deciding the theory of property. I'm determining it.
So you're setting this out as an investigation, and you're finding this as like a discovery almost.
Yes.
Whereas I don't think that any of this can be a discovery because it's all justified by moral principles. It's all justified by what I want anyways.
I disagree completely.
And that's fine. And the disagreement can go to that deeper level. But I don't think there's nothing to discover that justifies any type of property outside of a moral principle.
But I didn't make reference to any oughts here. I had never said you objectively ought to care about who has the property right. I just said you can objectively determine who does have the property right. So this is not a moral theory. This is a legal theory. It's not like mathematics, right? You are discovering mathematics rather than just deciding it.
There was some level of morality in there, or should, as to, who should or who should not have the right of property ownership,
Well, like
right?
I'm
Decided.
very careful with my words. I'm not talking about oughts here. I'm not saying that this person ought to have the property right. I'm saying, right, let's figure out if they do have the property right. Either they do or they don't. So let's find out. We go back to the first principle of conflict avoidance, and let's see which one has the property right. I'm not saying that the person who has the property right should have the property right, or somebody else should have the property right. I'm saying they just do. It's just a fact that they do.
It's just a fact that they do. Yeah. I don't see how that can be concluded in any objective sense.
Well, I just did it for you because we can
You
determine
just did it.
based on conflict avoidance. We can see which property theory would actually avoid conflict. We assign the property rights based on conflict avoidance. The person who's initiating the conflict is the aggressor. They are the one who does not have the property right.
Yes, but there's all types of possession that is unlawful, that is against property rights
Sure. Yeah.
in any system of property, in slavery and feudalism and capitalism, and any conceivable contrivance, right? And
Yeah.
it's just the same. It would be just the same in any idealized system of, whatever type. I'm not saying what it's going to look like, but whatever type of property minimizes this type of contradiction, this type of aggression, there will still be some aggression in it.
I'm not
There
claiming
will
that.
be.
I'm not claiming that based on natural law there will never ever be aggression ever again. I'm just saying natural law theory allows you to discover who is in the wrong, who is the one who's acting illegally. It's the
Yes, but
framework.
if we have, this person possessing and transgressing, so to speak, someone else's property, and we have this disagreement, you know, something has to come in and say who's whose, or
Mm,
what belongs to who,
yeah, and that is the
right?
theory of property.
That's the theory of property, right?
Hmm.
So where is the problem in me saying that just in certain circumstances that possession, right, that, I guess, appropriation of previously held property is just okay because of the specific circumstances surrounding it that are logically distinct?
Well, because it's just arbitrary. You just decided it a priori. You didn't actually derive it.
It's not arbitrary because it corresponds to the
Well, it's
ends
absolutely arbitrary
that I seek
because you didn't
to.
derive it from conflict avoidance. So we can determine whether your hypothetical theory of property is correct based on whether it avoids conflict. If it doesn't avoid conflict, it's an incorrect theory of property.
Yeah, but you've only you have to start with this singular homesteading principle that
I,
grounds
I
property
didn't
claim.
start with the homestead principle. I derived the homestead principle from conflict avoidance. I started from conflict avoidance because that is the purpose of
Yeah, but
property.
it feels like each of these things requires one of the other things
It absolutely does
that you
not.
said previously to
Every,
justify it, right?
everything
Like,
everything relies on conflict avoidance. All the theory of property does is it is assigning who has the property right based
yes, but
on
what is
what would avoid
conflict?
conflict. Conflict over scarce means that let's take for example my beer can here. If I was trying to use this beer can to drink, but you were trying to use it to pour over some chicken or something, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you're making beer
Mm-hmm.
can chicken. We can't both do that at the same time. So we have a
Mm-hmm.
conflict over that. We are trying to implement the same scarce means, the beer can, towards contradictory ends that cannot both be attained simultaneously. That's a conflict.
Yes, but how do we get from the end of property is conflict avoidance, i.e.,
I,
that situation avoidance,
what do you mean? What do you mean by the
to,
end of property? I don't think property
well, you
acts. It
said
can't have
the
ends.
point of,
Yeah, the purpose of it.
yeah, that's kind of what I mean, right? How do you get from that to, it never, to the homesteading principle being the law of the land all the way down,
Uh,
so to speak?
well, I can
Because
drive.
I can think of situations, where an alternative type of property might very well avoid more conflicts of that nature.
Well, let me derive it based solely on conflict avoidance, right? We want to just go from conflict avoidance. Necessarily, anything which would negate that is gonna have to be outlawed, right? Because the point of the legal system is conflict avoidance. So the initiation of conflict, which is the negation of conflict avoidance, has to be outlawed, which is how we get to the non-aggression principle. So let's look at just the abstract case. A comes along, A begins implementing X as a means towards some end, and then B attempts to implement X towards as a means towards a contradictory end. They cannot both go on at the same time. We have a conflict. It must be that B is the one who has initiated this conflict, because the causal chain only involves it being property. It only involves it being implemented as a means towards some end when A begins doing that. So B has initiated the conflict. And that's how we get to homesteading. A has homesteaded the X. He has homesteaded the means
I
X.
see the problem. I see the problem. I viewed the entire thing of saying the point of property is conflict avoidance and sort of that type of thing as kind of like looking at the different types of property and saying, well, would there be more of these disagreements to occur that would lead to the conflict in this or that society? Whereas you're seeing it just sort of in a vacuum. I guess if that makes sense, I'm having a hard
Yeah.
time expressing what I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So I might say that, well, that conflict only occurred because of the initial possession. Right. And if we had a different type of property that didn't consider that possession as legitimate, then we'd have less sort of conflicts
Right. So
occurring.
who would the property right there be assigned to in your system that you're proposing now? A or B? Who gets
Well, in
assigned the
most
property right?
circumstances, it would go to A, but if A used it in a certain way,
Okay,
and
right.
A would know that this was part of the social contract or
But
whatever,
if it ever assigned the property right to B, which is the only other choice, then it's necessarily a false theory of property because it's not avoiding conflict. Because B is the initiator of the conflict.
but it is avoiding conflict because this mode of property is being violated less times
What do you
because
mean by
there's
that?
less there could be hypothetically a system where there is less impetus to transgress on others' property,
All right, I don't know what you mean by that.
which would be you don't know what I mean. What don't you know that I mean
Right,
by it?
so if it's ever going to be the case that your property system is assigning the property right to B rather than A, that is a false theory of property because it assigns the property right to the aggressor, the one who initiated conflict. So this is not a conflict avoiding system of property. So it's a false system of property because the purpose of property is conflict avoidance. Right, and
Yeah, but
we're not just deciding the system based on like, well, I reckon this might avoid conflicts because X, Y, Z. No, we can determine objectively whether it avoids conflicts.
it feels like there's something further that is justifying this, and I'm thinking it has to do with initial possession, and that somehow that alone begets a type of initial ownership. The use of something that someone has engaged with or made explicit that they're using it to some ends, the contrary use of that thing by someone else. I wouldn't say that's always what was the word? It always keeps slipping my mind. I don't know what's up with it.
Avoids conflict?
Yeah,
Well, like,
it doesn't always avoid conflict.
okay, right.
I don't always consider it conflict.
So then where in my
But
syllogism did I slip up? Because I started from the premise of conflict avoidance and I derived for you the Homestead principle. So where in that derivation did I slip up?
it's not in the validity of anything that you're saying. And that's partially why I'm having a hard time pushing back against you, because there's very little for me to, other than pure contradiction. Um, I just don't find sound some of the things that you say. So, for example, why is it that we should hold this importance to initial possession?
Well, I
Right.
derived it for you. If you care at all about conflict avoidance, you necessarily must care about the first comer.
Yes, because that's how conflict is defined.
I mean, yeah, if you define conflict differently, then the things I'm saying are different. That's true of literally every
Yeah.
fucking argument on Earth.
But if I say, actually, no, this thing, because of the system of property that we live in and we've accepted, um, is not owned in this specific circumstance by this person, well, then the conflict was initiated by them,
Right. When
right?
you say things like the system of property we live in and has been accepted, it makes it sound to me like you think there could be another system of property, and that it was just kind of an arbitrary decision that we had this system of property rather than another system of property. But I'm saying no. There's an
It's not
objectively
arbitrary.
there's an objectively correct system of property. Only one system of property is objectively correct. All others are objectively incorrect. You can't choose which system of
I'm
property you
well
ascribe
aware.
to.
I'm well aware that that's your position.
And my position is correct. I proved it for
I
you.
would like I would like you to convince me. I'm not convinced by that
All right.
because
So
I don't.
any theory of
I,
property, it either will be a theory that assigns property rights based on what actually avoids conflict, or it won't be. There's no in between there. And if it avoids conflict, then it's true. If it doesn't avoid
yeah.
conflict, then it's false.
Mm,
There's no in
yeah, I see
between.
it. Yeah, we are our disagreement and our misunderstanding was in how we were using conflict. To me, conflict has a whole bunch of different connotations to it that depending on the context. For you, conflict is just
Right. But I
if
defined
one
for you conflict.
possesses and it.
I defined
Yeah, I
conflict for
know,
you.
but
So yes, if you change the definition
I
of
could
conflict,
define anything. I could
yeah, if you
define
change the
anything
definition, then
around
the argument
and
changes. That's true of literally every fucking argument.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly,
so it's
right. So
utterly pointless. Who cares? It's a moot point.
so why does that
Well, it doesn't make my argument
anymore?
false because I have very explicitly, very formally defined what I'm talking about when I talk about conflict.
Well, I think I've very explicitly defined what I mean when I talk about a system of property. I think we all know logically what this
Right,
refers
but we
to and
both
what this
agreed
means.
that a
It's
system
not.
of property has to be conflict avoiding. We both agreed on that. That was intersubjective.
Yeah, but that's the see we had different understandings of proper of not property of conflict avoidance and what that entailed. And now I'm seeing that it's really just a pure contradiction here, because when I say that
All right.
property seeks the end or has the end of minimizing conflict in any sense, that means something differently to me than it does to you,
Okay, so
which is going to be the
what does it mean to
problem.
talk about a system of property if it's not dealing with conflict in how I said, right? The entire and I walked you through this earlier when the entire purpose of property is when we have a conflict over the use of something, over what end that means is going to be implemented towards. And the property system is assigning the property right to the person who justly owns it, right? It's dealing with this conflict.
Yeah, I just disagree on who justly owns it.
Right, so we can derive it objectively based on conflict avoidance because that was the purpose. It's for resolving this conflict.
Yeah, but I explained to you that we're not agreeing on conflict avoidance. So for me, conflict avoidance, I guess
What are you disagreeing with?
I could say to make this more clear that how you define conflict avoidance, I don't agree that specific understanding of conflict avoidance is something that should be, it should be the point of property.
Oh,
I think that would be the
okay, right. So what is property?
disagreement.
That is what I'm defining property as, though.
I would say that the end of property would be to, I guess in my view, avoid or minimize situations where the will of one is reduced, right? So that everyone's will is sort of,
What does it mean to reduce will?
well, what one wants to do. If one wants to possess something, one wants to, go out and do X, Y, or Z.
Okay, well they can
If
continue wanting.
property,
They can
if
continue wanting it all
property
they want,
is,
right? You could
yes, but
there could be a woman who wants to not have sex with me, and she can continue to want that whilst I rape her. It's irrelevant. I haven't reduced her will, have I?
wait, can you say that again?
So
I
right,
understand what you're asking me.
so you said the will is reduced when you're preventing them from wanting something, but they can continue wanting it whilst I'm aggressing on them. That's absolutely fine. I can rape a woman and she can continue to not want to have sex
No,
with me whilst I'm
I'm
raping her.
sorry. I didn't explain it further enough. The actualization of that will. It's not just the wanting, because anyone can want anything. You're absolutely correct about that, right? It's actualization of desires, right? So in a lot of cases, property sets up barriers between us and what we want to do. And I'm saying that the end of property should be, and this is what I call, in my sense, conflict avoidance, in a certain sense, is when we have a system of property where the majority of people are able to do as many things as they want as possible, and a property
Okay,
system that facilitates that.
so we have 10 people on a desert island. They're the only people on Earth. They're the only people who matter, right? 9 of those 10 people want to have sex with the remaining person. That person doesn't want to do it. So we want to make sure that the majority get to do what they want, right? That's what you just said.
Yeah. I mean, they're going to do it anyways.
And you think that's just?
I don't necessarily think it's just,
Why
because
not?
I would have to
You
appeal
assign
to
the
other
property
further
rights to the
principles.
majority.
I would have to, because I only say that about property because of other moral principles that I hold. So, for example, I think that a large society needs a system of property, and that system of property should seek to do this certain end, because as a rule, it sets up a society where people are, maximally happy in some sense. In this particular situation, I
What
would
do you
be
mean by
very
maximally happy?
skeptical.
You think when you talk about maximally happy, are you talking about utility comparisons or something like that?
Yeah, it's essentially a type of utilitarianism, but I'm not actually utilitarian. It's provisional,
Right.
right? So if in my assessment they're happier, and I would use various means to
So
assess
how do
that.
how
I
do
mean,
you
we
do
all
that then?
do. Well, we could ask them. You
Like lie.
generally know
Right.
when someone's,
So how are you doing like a comparison of utility between me and you? Right. Let's say I like a hot dog. You say I like a hot dog too. How do you determine who likes the hot dog more or less?
well, you'd have to, first of all, saying you don't know is a valid answer, but there could be
Okay. Right.
clues
But your
based on the
property
past on
system
who likes it
requires
more.
that you figure out who likes it
But we
more.
have to take estimations
Well, how would you do that?
based off of, we do that based off of surveys,
All right.
that
So
type of
what would this
thing.
survey question? How would you design a survey question in such
Now,
a way that you can
this is
determine who likes it more? Because they both just
this
say that
is
they
not
like it.
how. First of all, this is not how I would determine property in a given social structure. I
You said it
think
was.
this is my reasoning for why property should be a specific way. So I think that in my estimation, people would be able to actualize their will more in a particular type of property. And that would be my final answer for anything. I'm not proposing some absurd, what is it, Byzantine system, not Byzantine, like Byzantine bureaucracy, where we like have a bunch of people on computers calculating everyone's experience preference, stuff like that. I'm not proposing that at all, because that would be unreasonable and would negate its end, right?
The end being maximizing the actualization of will, right?
Yeah, and I have to default to my own understanding of what would facilitate that, and to a large extent, I default to the individual because I don't trust myself, right? I'm not a
Why the
pure
default of the individual if you're
utilitarian.
talking about the maximization of the actualization of will? Two outweighs one.
The reason that I subscribe to that particular model is because I want to live in a society where I can do as much as I want as possible.
Okay, yes, but that is what
without
you
a
said.
risk. Without a risk.
Because you said
Well,
maximization of the actualization of will. So two people wanting something is clearly going to outweigh one person wanting that thing. So you have majority rule here.
Yes, but I clarified that by saying I'm not actually a utilitarian. That was one of the first things that I said about
yes,
that.
but then your theory of property is entirely contrary to what you were talking about, right? So what is your actual theory of property then?
The theory of property exists to serve that end because I live in a society and I wish the society to have that type of property.
No, but you don't.
So that I can...
You don't wish that because I've reduced it to absurdity and you said, no, I don't like that. So you don't want that.
No, I might not like that for many different reasons. Number one, because I'd be very skeptical.
Yes, but the point is that you don't like that. So you lied to me when you said you ascribe to this theory of property because you like it.
It may be necessary. It may, in fact, be necessary. I can think of circumstances.
It may be necessary to have a couple of rapes going on.
Yeah, I mean, like, if someone's gonna vaporize the earth if you don't do it, I mean, I have a strong intuition.
What if it would just prevent? What if it would just prevent this large group of people from actualizing their will and having sex with a woman? We gotta maximize the actualization of will.
If, in my estimation, the minimizing and the restriction of their will creates suffering to an extent that is so great that it would outweigh the suffering caused by the rape, then yes. But I will be very skeptical that that situation would ever occur.
But how are you measuring suffering? Is there such thing as a disutil?
Yeah, I don't see why not.
So
like I said, it's provisional.
A disutil? What unit? Is there like a disutilometer you can use?
It's not a real thing that exists.
Oh,
it's a concept that I came up with. It's a concept I came up with.
So then how are you doing this balancing act of determining if the suffering caused by actualization of will is so much that it would outweigh the actualization of the will? How do you do that little balancing act?
I do it by ascertaining what I think would be the answer based on any number of things leading up to that circumstance.
So you just
obviously, if I'm an observer, yeah, I have to decide. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to my decision.
Right. So you don't actually have a way of determining this. You just kind of, I think this.
There are ways that are better and there are ways that are worse. I mean, I know how people feel. I know how things feel to me and to them. I can ask them questions. I can get to know people, and through doing this, I can know when someone's feeling better. This is
an entirely arbitrary theory of property. It's just, well, just go up and ask Lord Pastor what he thinks should happen every fucking time. You see how that's ridiculous and arbitrary? It's
not ridiculous at all. It's in fact how everybody, well, I wouldn't say that. It's in fact how an honest way of me giving my opinion. It is my opinion. My political opinions are my political opinions. Yeah, and so are yours.
You have an entirely your opinion of what property is it's an entirely arbitrary system. My one isn't.
Yes, but I can define what I'm trying to do, and I can explain it to someone.
Define things as you want, and it's ridiculous. It's utterly pointless. It's just, well, my theory of property is that we should just always ask me what should happen. So I can. and you don't even have to be
Well, yes,
consistent.
you're having a discussion with me about what I think about property.
Yes, but the point
So
is your
obviously it's going
theory
to come
isn't
down to what I
consistent.
think.
Your theory isn't consistent. It's
Where
just
is the
whatever.
inconsistency?
It's just whatever you
Why
decide.
have I violated?
You aren't actually determining who has the property right in any given situation. You're
You
just
said
going,
it's inconsistent. Where is it
well, I
inconsistent?
think this one has it here and this one has it there.
Where is the
The
inconsistency?
inconsistency comes from the fact that you're not deriving it from some central axiom
Why is that inconsistent?
because it's arbitrary.
I absolutely am deriving it from something.
Where are you deriving it from
My
then?
preference. My preference. Utility
And
towards me
your
is the end to which all my opinions serve.
and this
I
is the
prefer to
property
be in
system,
a
right?
society. Yes, the property system derives from the fact that I have to live in a society with other people, and I would want in that society to have the least
So
risk of others
your big counter
restricting
system.
my.
Your big counter system to Ancap is, well, I want a society where I'm in charge of everything and nobody else gets to do anything unless I say they
No.
can.
When is that what I said?
Because you said your property system assigns property rights based on what you say, rather than some adherence to some principle.
It's called a political opinion. It's called having an opinion on an issue.
Yeah, it's called having a retarded opinion.
It has reasons. Ah, okay.
Like, do you not see
I
how
mean,
that's...
you're free to sit here and say that your opinion reflects objective reality as much as you want to.
Because it does.
Right? But it's still simply your opinion on the matter, and I remain unconvinced that it reflects an objective fact.
But
of
your big
property.
counter system to ANCAP is just, well, I want to be in charge of everything.
No,
that's
and I
not
never
really a
said
counter
that.
system. It is.
I never said that.
You said property is assigned based on what you want.
I'm not going to let you.
Rather than
I'm not going to let you
principle.
sit here and say that I want to dictate everyone's lives.
Of course it is, because you said your property system assigns property based on what you want to happen in the given situation. You just guess
yes,
what's
it's called I have an opinion. It's called I have an opinion.
I know it's called you have an opinion, and it's a retarded opinion.
I have the opinion for reasons.
Right, and you can have whatever fucking opinions you want, but it's still true that your property system, your big counter system to ANCAP, is that everybody just asks you who should win out in any given conflict.
It's not purely me because I have to reconcile my will with that of others because I live in a society with other people.
How are you determining it then?
Just like if I want to bake a cake,
because before you said you're determining it by asking you what you want. You said you were determining it by just your opinion, your sole opinion. That is how it determines who has the property right. So how are you actually doing that if it's not just you?
Ultimately, it is derived from my preference.
So yes, the property system is just you on top, and you just dictate everything.
No,
you don't see how that's a ridiculous system.
That's disanalogous. I'm not.
It's not an analogy.
My opinion.
I'm directly stating what your property system is that you're proposing here. You're proposing a property system where, in some given conflict, right, 10 men want to use one woman's body to have sex, and she doesn't. You're like, well, I think the woman should win out there. You're not deriving that from anything.
I'm deriving it from my preferences and what
so,
society I'd want to live in.
Therefore, your property system is ask Lord Pasta what he thinks should happen. How is that not Lord Pasta dictatorship?
Because it has to, first of all, it is based in my preference. I'm not going to lie to you about that. But my preference also has to reconcile itself with a reality external to it. And I have preferences as an individual. I want certain things in society. I want to do certain things. Other people want those things too. So if I'm talking to someone and I say, hey, we want to do things, you know.
Yeah, but this is assuming all agreement. The entire purpose of property is dealing with conflicts. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what fucking property system you have if everybody agrees to everything. Like, kumbaya, who cares? Property only comes up when you actually have
some people disagree and they will
get the bullet.
They'll face
the wall.
Yeah, people who enslave people. I disagree with slavery. I disagree with all these types of
what if they just look at you funny and you're like, yeah, I get them, because it's all based on your preference. You assign the property right over their body to yourself. I don't agree with that because
if I advocated for that type of society, it could backfire against my will.
No, but that's the point. Your property system is just ask Lord Pasta what should happen in any given dispute. So you could literally just say, well, I want that woman's body now. right?
Yeah, but I don't.
Right, but you could. So that's my point. It's you might be a benevolent dictator. I'm not saying you'd necessarily be some evil guy or anything, right? But your counter system to Ancap is Lord past a dictatorship.
Well, I don't see how your system of morality or ethics is any different from mine. I mean,
Well, then you probably weren't paying
if
attention.
you're claiming that it reflects some objective morality, then that would require some
I'm not
proof.
claiming
I'm
that.
unconvinced.
I'm not claiming that it reflects objective morality.
Or
'Cause,
objective reality in some sense.
yes, well, yes, it reflects what conflict is.
Why should I care about conflict? In the
Well,
way
you're
that
arguing. The fact that you're engaging in argumentation shows that you care about conflict avoidance. Because you're choosing to come to the truth based on a conflict-free way of interacting, rather than a conflict-full way of interacting. So therefore, you are demonstrating a preference for conflict avoidance over conflict initiation, which makes it impossible to argue against my system of property. You get yourself into a contradiction when you try to do that.
Hey, can you go into detail about that?
Right,
Please?
so basically, when I, let's say there are a couple shirts I could buy. I buy a red shirt instead of a blue shirt. I'm showing a preference for that red shirt over that blue shirt in that moment. I'm demonstrating a preference based on my choice. So, similar things happen in terms of argumentation. Argumentation is a conflict-free way of interacting. You're choosing to get to the truth based in conflict avoidance rather than conflict initiation.
Yeah.
So you're demonstrating a preference for conflict
In this
avoidance.
context. In
Exactly.
this context.
And you do that whenever you argue. Whenever you're arguing, you're demonstrating a preference for conflict-free ways of interacting. So therefore, you cannot argue
Yes, but
for
sometimes I
conflict.
don't do that.
Right.
Sometimes
But
I don't do that.
But the
There's
point
no
is,
contradiction there.
But the point is, I don't care about when you're not doing that. I care about what you're doing right now. Right now, you're demonstrating a preference for conflict-free ways of interacting. Therefore,
in this specific context.
right. And you do that every single time you argue. Therefore, whenever you're arguing, you would contradict yourself in arguing for conflict.
That's silly.
It's absolutely not silly. Where in that little
Because
deduction did I slip up?
I could be arguing for conflict in a different context other than arguing.
But that would be contradicting your actions.
How so? How's that a contradiction?
You contradict your actions by you are acting in a way which demonstrates a preference for conflict avoidance, but you are saying that you want conflict initiation. It's a contradiction.
In a context, in a certain context, not in that specific context. I see no contradiction there.
Then you're not paying attention.
Okay. So the way that I'm seeing this is that I can engage with someone in a discussion about conflict, and I can say, oh, there's this other situation over there. I think that I don't consider conflict as important in that context over there. But right here, let's talk about that. Why do you think that it should be something we consider there?
Right, and in talking about it, and you demonstrate a preference for conflict-free ways of interacting, right? Do you agree with that?
In that context. Yes, exactly.
You are demonstrating a preference for interacting in conflict-free ways. Do you agree?
I am demonstrating a preference in that context.
Again, I don't know what you mean by in that context.
For not having a conflict.
What do you mean in that context?
Well, because time exists. I mean,
at other points, you could demonstrate a preference for initiation of conflict. I absolutely agree, but not whilst you're arguing.
Not whilst I'm arguing. Well,
whenever you're engaging in argumentation, you are demonstrating a preference for conflict-free ways of interacting.
I didn't make a claim about something in arguing. I made a claim about something over there that we were arguing about.
Okay, right. I don't think you're getting my point here. It's certainly possible that you could go around stabbing people and stuff like that, and when you're stabbing them, you are demonstrating a preference for conflict initiation. I absolutely agree there. But then, when you start arguing, when you engage in an argumentation, you are demonstrating a preference for conflict-free ways of interacting. In that moment, you are demonstrating a preference for conflict-free ways of interacting.
Yeah. There's no contradiction.
Okay, right. But do you agree on that?
Yes, I agree that.
Okay, so whenever you're arguing, you would get yourself into a contradiction if you try to argue for conflict initiation, because you are demonstrating that you prefer
No,
conflict avoidance.
no, because it's only proven in one context.
Okay,
That's what
right.
you laid out.
You are demonstrating you prefer conflict avoidance, and you're saying that you think there should be conflict initiation.
In another context.
Ooh,
Yeah, there's no
ooh, ooh.
contradiction there.
You are
Yeah, there's no
demonstrating.
contradiction. Where's the contradiction?
Stop using
It's
the
over
word
there.
in another
It's
context.
literally it's
You're
literally
not
over
saying
there in
actual
another place
words.
in another time. I am speaking actual
Okay,
words here. They have meaning,
right? When
right? If
you agreed, when you are arguing, you're demonstrating a preference for conflict avoidance. Is that correct?
in
Could I
in the
argue for
context of
something that I
arguing,
don't prefer? Could I say nobody should ever argue? Could I make that argument?
no.
Exactly. I'd be
I
contradicting
mean, I
myself.
wouldn't know. I wouldn't know what it would mean to say that.
Right, exactly.
But
It doesn't make sense for me to argue that nobody should ever argue. It's a contradiction. I contradict myself.
yes,
The
exactly. It
same
is a
thing happens
contradiction.
when you argue, because I'm showing that I prefer arguing than not arguing. Right? So you contradict I would contradict myself in making that argument. Same thing happens when I argue for conflict initiation, because I'm demonstrating a preference for conflict avoidance. So I've contradicted my actions in my words. So I must be objectively wrong.
I really don't know where the misunderstanding is with this one.
The
I
misunderstanding is
gotta be
that
real.
in that you are just unwilling to accept the premises. We've gone through each premise, and then you agree to each premise along the way, and then when I say okay, therefore the conclusion, you say no, no, no.
The context that we had agreed to is that I am having an argument with you about conflict.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Or I'm making an argument.
it doesn't matter
for,
what you're arguing about. Whenever you're
if
arguing,
you're saying that I would argue,
whenever you're
if
arguing, you demonstrate a preference for conflict avoidance. We agreed on this. So therefore, you cannot argue
in
for
that
conflict
only
initiation.
in that context.
Okay, what do you mean by in
Only
that
in the
context?
In the context of having a debate, a discussion.
Yes. You demonstrate the preference for conflict avoidance.
Yeah.
So similarly
In
to
that
how
discussion.
so similarly to how I fail, how I contradict myself when I argue that nobody should ever argue, I fail when I argue
that's not the
for
same at
conflict
all.
initiation. It is the same. It's literally the same.
It's entirely different because
My words go against
listen,
my actions.
my
It's
my
identical.
point is only that I at 1 second can wear glasses and at another second can take them off.
Yes.
But I am not in contradiction with myself. Why? Because it is in a different context.
Right? Okay.
It's in a different context.
I
that
agreed
had
before
glasses.
that you can change your preferences over time. I'm not saying the preferences are set in stone always. I could be arguing here, showing that I love conflict avoidance right now, but then I could walk out that door, walk downstairs, and stab a person. And in stabbing that person, I show that I demonstrate the opposite preference. Preferences can change. I completely agree. But I don't have to care.
I'm not even talking about changing preferences.
But I don't have to care about any of the time in your life where you aren't arguing, because truth claims, propositions of truth, can only be made in the course of an argumentation. So whenever you're talking about truth, something being truthful, you are demonstrating that you prefer conflict avoidance.
Whenever I talk about truth, I'm demonstrating a preference for conflict avoidance. Explain that.
So when I make a proposition, when I'm saying this thing is true, this statement is true, I can only raise that proposition in the course of an argumentation. Raising a proposition is what argumentation is about. Raising propositions and debating over those propositions. That's the point of argumentation. So when I'm arguing, I can only ever present something as true in the course of an argumentation, and in presenting that thing to be true, I demonstrate a preference for conflict avoidance. So if that proposition was, we should initiate conflict, I would contradict my actions.
Whatever I say is just gonna make you angry, but
Probably.
because all of those problems of contradiction are resolved by isolating the conflict to a specific instance, separate from argumentation. It literally is, because it's speaking about a separate thing. It's speaking about a separate thing in a separate
Okay,
context.
right. It doesn't matter what time it is. You are proposing that it's true that, in some case, we should be initiating conflict. But you're showing that you're preferring to not initiate conflict.
No, I'm not.
Yes.
I'm not showing that.
You
How am I
are.
showing that?
We agreed that you were showing that. We agreed on
I was
that.
showing a preference for conflict avoidance in argumentation in that specific moment, and I clarified this many times. This is not complicated.
In arguing, you are showing that you prefer conflict avoidance to conflict initiation in that moment.
In that moment, in that specific context.
Right.
In arguing.
So you could not ever argue for conflict initiation.
That does not follow.
It does follow, just like
It's a
how I
non
couldn't
sequitur.
argue that you shouldn't argue.
It's totally not the same.
It is the
You're
same.
trying to me, this is like saying
The reason I can't argue that one should not argue is because my actions are going against my words. I'm contradicting myself. I'm in what Hoppe calls a performative contradiction. The same happens.
I agree.
When I try.
Understand that.
Right now, I am wearing a red shirt. Right, it's red and black. I could never argue that people should not wear red and black. I couldn't argue that right now because I'm contradicting my actions.
I agree.
Similarly, I couldn't argue that people should initiate conflict because I'm demonstrating. I'm contradicting my actions.
If you're wearing a red shirt and you engage in an argument, and the thing that you are arguing is that there is a good or bad time to wear a red shirt, there is no contradiction.
Right, but it's about preferences in the moment. Right, it's not about in some point in the future. It's about what your preferences are right now.
Yes, and I've already conceded to you that in the moment, in the context, my preference is for conflict avoidance.
Right, so let's say you're proposing, what's some initiation conflict that you propose should be allowed, right? What is some conflict? I want to get a concrete example here. What is
we could think of a simple trolley problem or something like that.
Okay, so the trolley problem. You see there's a trolley problem going on, and you say, hey, you should violate these property rights. But you'd be contradicting yourself. Because you'd have to say that in the moment. You'd have to argue that in the moment.
Well, all I would have to argue is that in that context, it would be justified to violate the property rights. Or that in that context, the property rights do not apply because their utility no longer exists.
Okay, right. When you are arguing for that, you are demonstrating that you prefer to not violate property rights when you're saying that. Whereas you'd be arguing for violating property rights. It's a contradiction. And let's say the guy pulls the lever or whatever, he violates property rights, he kills the guy, right? Mm-hmm. In this case, right, you're in court, you're saying, right, we should not abide by proportionality. But you'd be contradicting yourself because you're saying that we should initiate conflict whilst you're preferring conflict avoidance.
I think this might be the problem. That when I say a preference for conflict avoidance in a specific conflict, in a specific context, at a specific time, I'm not expressing that I have a universal desire against conflict. I would never say that. What I'm merely expressing is that in argumentation, in that context, I would be against conflict Does that
Right,
help you to
okay.
see where I'm coming from?
But in the event of any conflict, like my point is, we can move on if it's just we're gonna get stuck or something. But my point is that in any conflict, when the conflict is occurring, you couldn't argue that the initiator of conflict has the property right. You couldn't argue that. You contradict yourself. Because it's happening in that moment. And in that moment, you're demonstrating a preference for conflict avoidance.
No, because as I just said, my express preference for conflict avoidance is not universal. It's contextual.
Okay, right, yes. But when you're in that moment and you're adjudicating over this conflict, there's this conflict which is happening, you couldn't say, because this is an ongoing thing. This is an conflict happening right now.
Yes, it's happening. Yeah, okay.
When you argue, if you were to argue anything, you would demonstrate a preference for the conflict avoidance, right?
No, because it's contextual, and that's another context.
It's at the same time though. It's at the same time that you were
but
demonstrating your preference.
the only thing,
Because your issue before was that it's off in it might be off in the future.
Time
right?
is not the only thing that exists. There are also other dimensions.
Okay, right. So if it's in a different place, suddenly you're not contradicting yourself.
Yeah.
How?
Because it's in a different place.
But why does
It's
that mean
unique.
that?
It's
Why does that
unique.
mean that you are allowed to prefer conflict avoidance whilst arguing for the exact negation of that?
Because I'm not expressing a universal condemnation of conflict.
Right. But it's in your actions. You can either prefer conflict initiation or conflict avoidance. You can't mix and match these things. It's one or the other.
I can make it contextual, which is not at all what you're saying. If it's contextual, it's not what you're saying. It's contradictory if I say I prefer conflict avoidance as a categorical statement. If I say that and then I also advocate in the next breath, or like say simultaneously, for conflict, I'm in contradiction.
That's
I 100%
exactly what
see
argumentation
that,
does.
but
because you're communicating your preference based on the fact that you're arguing.
Yes, I understand that argumentation entails this type of preference for conflict avoidance. I understand that. But
Yes,
if
so
I say
you are
that
doing
it's
what you said. Well,
contextual,
if I
then
were to
it's
say
not
it,
categorical.
right, your position is that if you were to say that you preferred conflict avoidance whilst arguing for conflict initiation, then you'd be in contradiction. But not if you simply demonstrating it through your actions. That seems ridiculous
Sorry,
to me.
my audio cut out on my stream. Can you hear me now? You should be able to hear me now.
Yeah, I can hear you. Are you good to go?
Okay, I should be good now.
So, I was just asking there, is your position that, well, if I were to say at the same time, let's say you have two mouths, right? One mouth is saying, I think we should, I prefer conflict avoidance. The other mouth is saying, I prefer conflict initiation. This would be a contradiction, yes?
Of course it would be.
Okay, right. But what if it wasn't just two mouths? What if you only had one mouth, but you were demonstrating to people, through acting, right, through basically sign language, that you are demonstrating a preference for conflict avoidance while saying you prefer conflict initiation? How is that not the same as just having the two mouths?
It is very similar. I would say it's also contradictory. Right, but that's
that is also
very clearly not what I'm expressing.
Okay, right.
I'm
but
saying that the claim that I make
right.
when I engage in argument.
You just said that would also be contradictory.
Someone in my chat is saying that I'm still. Oh my goodness, I am still muted. That's weird.
My stream
What
will
on
be
your end?
On my end, I should be fine. I can hear you still. If you want the audio there, my stream is Creative Commons, so you can just rip the audio from my stream if you want to like edit this together at any point.
I might have to do that because this is. I mean, I don't know why people are saying that I'm muted when I'm clearly seeing now that
they might be trolling you.
Well, that could be possible.
Yeah. So anyway,
but like,
right, you agree that me acting can be like a pseudo second mouth, right?
Yeah, of course. It's like the person saying like, "Don't trust the thing I say." You
Yeah,
know, do I believe that? You know, I'm familiar with this,
right.
but
So, so that is argumentation ethics. That is you through your actions. Your second mouth is saying that you prefer conflict avoidance, whilst your actual mouth is saying that you prefer conflict initiation. It's a contradiction.
yeah, but from my perspective, with arguing, I am agreeing. It is necessitated. The threshold in order to do that without contradiction is not a universal claim of conflict avoidance, but is instead contextual to argumentation.
I don't see how you can have any preference which isn't in the moment universal. You are showing that you prefer this thing right now. At some other point, you might prefer something else, right? That's
Well,
possible.
when I say that it's in a sense universal, I mean that it applies to, all situations without context, right? But it would be sufficient to avoid contradiction for me to only say avoid conflict in a specific context. I think that's pretty straightforward, right?
Well, I mean, but like, so universal, right? That those different contexts, they would have to occur at different times, right?
They could occur at the same time. The only thing that would be required
So
is
wait,
if they were logically distinct from each other, if they were distinct
so do you
things.
think it's possible in one moment to have these two different contexts going on simultaneously? So in that single moment, you both prefer something and prefer its negation.
I think it's possible for me to say that it is okay to avoid conflict in a specific argument that I'm having with someone,
Okay, right.
and also at the same time say that in another context it's okay to have conflict.
Um, right. But that those different contexts would have to take place at different times. It couldn't be at the same time. You couldn't both prefer something and not prefer that.
Well, it could be because the preference for conflict avoidance is contextual to the conversation, and I would have and I the reason I say that is because the threshold for contradiction avoidance is
Like this is
it's merely contextual.
that just seems
It's
ridiculous to
not
me that a
universal.
person could both prefer something and prefer its negation at the same time. At different times they could,
No,
but not at the same time. That
that's
violates the
not
law of
what I'm claiming.
non-contradiction.
I'm specifically saying that they're
Right.
distinct
So
entities.
if they couldn't
That
do that, if they could not both prefer something and not prefer something at the same time, you couldn't have this thing where you have both these contexts going on simultaneously, where you both prefer conflict avoidance and prefer conflict initiation. You couldn't have that at the same time. Later on you might go out and fucking stab somebody. I agree there, but you couldn't at the
yeah,
same
but that's
time.
not a
In the moment, you couldn't argue for conflict initiation.
I could if I contextualized them and separated them. If I made the universal claim, if I said it is always wrong to initiate conflict,
I
if
don't
I made that claim, I would be in contradiction.
I don't need that.
It,
All I need is for you to, in this moment, say that you prefer conflict initiation in this moment, whilst acting in argumentation. It's all in this moment, right now. If you were to argue for a conflict initiation in this moment.
yeah,
Because,
so if I were to say that um, if you're starving, you can steal bread. If I were to make that claim,
well,
I'm
can
in
steal bread.
contradiction with, or you ought to. If you're
Yeah,
starving, you
okay.
ought to steal bread. If I make that claim, I'm in contradiction with myself by arguing with you right now, by
Well, like,
claiming it.
it's more involved than that, obviously, because you're not all right now necessarily. It could be like, well, at some point in the future. But let's say you see some child has stolen some bread or something, and you say, well, I think I prefer that the conflict there was initiated. I prefer a world in
Mhm.
that having that conflict initiation. But you are contradicting
Mm.
yourself by doing that. Because you, right in that moment, you've seen it. You're seeing it happen. In that moment, you are demonstrating a preference for conflict avoidance. I'm just gonna go to the toilet
But
real
wouldn't
quick
the
as well.
Yeah, you know what? I'll do that also. Um,
I actually get to test out my cool new BRB screen now. There we
Coolio.
go. Oh yeah. So I'll be back in a second.
Me too.
All right, I'm back. Are you back yet? You guys not. So anyway.
All right.
Oh, there you are. Did I hear right?
So
There we go.
where were we?
We were talking about argumentation ethics. We're kind of in a little bit of a rut there. Do you want to keep talking about argumentation ethics, or do you want to move on to something else?
I want to clarify. I understand what you mean by contradiction, square circle, married bachelor, that type of thing. I'm just saying that this specific instance is not like that because it's distinct. I'm making a distinction. I'm not making a claim that contradicts that distinction, right?
Right. Well,
The thing that I've distinguished.
I don't think you can. I don't know what you mean by making a distinction here.
Well, if I by making the claim that I prefer conflict avoidance in a time, place, context in an argument, I am meeting the threshold for avoiding contradiction by not making a claim that would contradict with arguing for aggression in another context, right? That claim is distinctly not arguing for initiation of force
Right. So
in some other context.
maybe you could intellectually make some claim like in some other place at other time, it would be fine, right? But the point is, when you actually get to that place and time, when there's the conflict happening, you couldn't argue because you are in the moment. When you argue, you demonstrate preference or conflict avoidance. So you couldn't argue that you prefer that conflict to be initiated.
Well, I'm saying that you don't demonstrate that. You merely, to meet the threshold of being in that situation, all you have to do is demonstrate a preference for that specific time and place and argumentation.
Yes, so in that specific time and place, you couldn't argue that in that specific time and place there you prefer conflict initiation.
Yeah, I'd agree with that
Cool.
because that's just contradicting yourself.
Exactly.
Like that's like me saying, you ought to do X, you ought not do X. No, I agree with that. But I don't see how that's relevant to why I'm contradictory for holding my views on morality, for example, or my views on property, for example.
Well,
Because
like
those are all contextual.
the point of this is why you should care about conflict avoidance, and the point is, whenever there would be a conflict, you couldn't argue for conflict initiation. You can argue that you prefer for that conflict to have been initiated. You couldn't do that whenever a conflict may occur.
If I'm in a conflict, I'm trying to parse what exactly you're trying to say here. If there's a conflict occurring and I'm in that conflict, it would be entirely possible for me to argue either for or against that conflict. Now, that depends on whether or not I'm initiating it and whether or not what's in question is my initiation. If I go around initiating force on people per the definition that you provided, and then I said that was wrong to do so, then I would be in contradiction.
Right. So
Right. I can see that. Right, but that's not what I'm saying at all.
But that means you couldn't ever, whenever a conflict might come up, at some point, if you were to say, well, the person who initiated that conflict, I prefer that they initiate it. You couldn't do that because you're in the moment, right?
I get you could say that you prefer they initiated it. I don't.
Well, you could say it, but you couldn't argue it because you'd contradict yourself.
How would there be a contradiction in that? I'm sorry. My dog's barking. It's distracting me a little bit. I'm sorry.
So basically, what you are showing that you prefer conflict avoidance while saying you prefer conflict initiation in that moment, right?
Well, by arguing, okay. Yeah, this is the problem. I view the arguing as its own specific context, right? That to suffice not being in contradiction with yourself, all you'd have to hold is that in the argument you don't have conflict.
Right, but when you are
that's the only preference you need.
But you're demonstrating that preference in that moment entirely, right? I couldn't both prefer something and not prefer something at the same time. I prefer.
I agree that. I agree with that.
So it's not a location issue; it's a time issue.
Yeah, but if it's at the same time in a different location, I can still make a distinction between them.
I disagree because I don't think I can say, well, right now I'm preferring red shirts to blue shirts, but not elsewhere, right? Because I'm only in one place.
Well, why not? I mean, that's perfectly logical. It doesn't contradict itself at all.
What would even make sense to say that I prefer red shirts, but I also prefer blue shirts to red shirts? Well, it doesn't make sense.
Well, it would make sense if you say, in this specific context, I prefer a red shirt. In all the other contexts, I prefer a blue shirt.
But the context, that's entirely consistent. The context being that specific slice in time where you demonstrate that preference. That's the context.
But if it were ever the case that I said what you're implying, that somewhere I'm saying something akin to this, I prefer wearing a blue shirt, but I prefer wearing a red shirt, like one after the other, just as statements of fact.
Well, yeah,
that I would be in contradiction. My preferences would be in contradiction.
Exactly. So, but the operative point being there, that the context is the slice in time that you're speaking about. The preference is demonstrated just in that moment. Because if you were somewhere else, it would be a different situation. It wouldn't be it wouldn't be the same context. That would be different. You can only be in one place. So wherever you are, that is the location that matters. When you start moving through time, though, then your preferences can change over time. But you can't be in multiple places at one single instant in time. So it doesn't make sense to talk about, well, in this instant in time, my preference here is this, my preference here is this, my preference over here is that, you know, and you have different preferences over the entire like universe in each moment in time. It doesn't make sense to talk about that because you were only in one place at each instant in time.
I get what you're saying. I want to find where you think this is happening in what I'm doing or what I've said thus far.
Well, because you're saying like, well, I mean, I could say that I prefer conflict avoidance over here, but over there, I prefer conflict initiation. But you're not over there.
Yeah,
You're only in
it
one
would be
place.
in a specific context. Yeah. There's no contradiction with that.
Well, there absolutely is, because you are demonstrating a preference for conflict avoidance whilst arguing for conflict
Yeah,
initiation.
because if I define it, if the threshold for avoiding that contradiction would be to prefer um, conflict avoidance in argumentation. Once that threshold has been achieved, I'm no longer in contradiction,
It's
right? If I don't make the if I don't if I just hold that and I don't make the further claim, I should clarify this. And if I don't make the further claim that I categorically don't like conflict, initiation,
right.
then I'd be contradictory. But I'm very specifically not making that claim. I would never claim that in all circumstances and for all things, I prefer to not initiate conflict.
Right. Okay. I don't think we're getting through to each other here because I think I'm speaking on like perhaps deep levels of praxeology here, which I'm not maybe not the best at communicating this. So I don't know if we're gonna get
I
any ground
feel
here.
yeah, I feel like a kind of similar lack of ability to communicate what I'm saying, although not obviously not like that.
Do you want to move on to a different topic? I think you said
Yeah, there were
initially
other
about
things.
making bold claims about all ANCAPs. So like
Yeah,
my point there was that basically um you you have this thing in like the description and you say it in the video where like, well, I was an ANCAP and I knew all the arguments and stuff. I was like, but like then the arguments you were making, the ANCAP arguments we were making were like very like baby ANCAP arguments. Which
yeah,
is
because I was 16.
yeah, but like
Yeah, like I probably should not have said things. I'm probably going to concede this one to you, actually. I probably should not have said things in a particular way that I said them. And I actually have a lot of semi respect for some ANCAPs. I don't like hate them as much as other leftists do,
hmm,
I guess.
well that's good.
So I apologize for saying that. At one point, I actually explicitly say that all ANCAPs must ascribe to insane hypotheticals. And when I heard that upon rewatching it, because it's a decently old video, I kind of cringed a little bit because before then I was I was making it about like how I had these views and when I sort of said I knew all the arguments, that's because I was in the ANCAP sphere of YouTube and I was hearing all the arguments. I knew all like the common like little, talking points that you do with your friends. Like if your friend wears a hat, does that make him able to take your money? Like stuff like that. I'm sure you've heard of the stuff like that.
Yeah, I get
You
you.
know,
I get you.
I'm not trying to say that all. First of all, you can be an ANCAP from multiple different philosophical perspectives, right? So I wouldn't be so bold as to claim that I know all the arguments for all of them,
Well,
like everybody's perspective there.
well, that's good. I guess we agreed on something then. Yeah. Did you have
Always
any
good to have
other?
agreement.
Did you have any other qualms with ANCAP?
No, the fundamental reason that I disagree with anarcho-capitalism is because it does not serve the ends to which I seek, for humanity. right? These would be. I don't believe that it grants people a level of autonomy that I want, and I'm willing to give up certain potential rights in society in order to gain a guarantee of autonomy in certain other aspects of life. Right, and maybe not everyone's willing to do that. I'm willing to accept that. You know, you're probably catching on that I'm a moral subjectivist. You know, maybe I have objections to that.
Oh no, I'm also a subjectivist.
Okay, cool. I
Actually,
mean, but even
to be
go
clear,
ahead.
I'm agnostic. I haven't seen like a rigorous proof of Hume's guillotine, but I've also never seen a counterexample to it.
Yeah, yeah. I think that some people can effectively try and argue that the is-ought distinction can simply be dissolved. Although I think the problem is much deeper than simply doing that. It's about reasoning from one category to another. You know, um, when you try to make the argument, it's still a non sequitur, basically.
Well, I do actually have something I think we could maybe talk about. I watched
Sure.
for like, I watched like the first couple of minutes of a VOD you had where you were
Mm.
watching Ancap videos like Brian Kaplan talking about something and you were like playing Minecraft. You
Oh
said something
yeah.
you said something about natural monopolies there. I don't think natural monopolies are a thing. I think monopolies can only come about as a state monopoly grant rather than
Hmm.
naturally forming.
Well, the reason that I think there are such things as natural monopolies um, has to do with how I think that things such as law would work themselves out in different types of social orders. And in any social order that I can kind of conceive of, there is always a final decider at the top. There's always some consensus that is made as to law and as to property and these types of things. And so I would call that effectively a type of state. And I think it's almost natural that it will naturally arise and be centralized. Right.
Well, like this is an opinion. This is a concept. Sorry, that my friend Idlework talks about a lot. Where it's basically like in any given system of arbitration, I'll call it in general, there's going to have to be some top level arbitration, right? You might
Yeah,
have
that's
like the
mhm.
small little like a small little court when like your neighbor thinks he owns a cow and you think you own it, and then when like you can't come to a resolution with that court, let's say that you have to go up a level, then you have to go up a level, and there's always going to be these top level arbitrators where if you cannot come to a conclusion at that top level arbitration, then the only solution you're left with is war, right? But that's true of every system. I don't think this implies some sort of a tendency towards monopolization because I don't think these top level arbitrators, they don't have to necessarily be monopolistic in any way. It could be different people,
Hmm.
different courts. It could rotate between a bunch of different courts who are the top level arbitration in all manner of different potential conflicts, right? A and
Yeah,
B might be in a conflict, and their top level arbitrator might be called AB. But then when BC get into a conflict, it might be BC who's the top level arbitrator, and it could be like that for any given pair of people. They could have a different top level arbitrator. It doesn't have to just be one top level arbitrator. It could be many, many, many arbitrators.
yes. But there yeah, and of course the legal order could change and stuff like that based off of who's chosen by which entity at which time. But I've actually had this conversation with another market anarchist who's a mutualist. I don't know if you have thoughts on mutualism or not.
Um,
And he basically said that there will be certain acts, and you probably agree with this, where you would be pulled into arbitration. Like for example, if you explicitly like attacked someone, you couldn't just run away and say, I don't agree to the arbiter, you know. um stuff like that. And what the threshold is for when someone is pulled in and when someone isn't pulled in has to be decided by someone, right, at some level. And I think that eventually there must be some agreement made. Right.
Well, like, this is why I get a little bit annoyed with some Ancaps who say, like, well, to be an Ancap is to like REAs and stuff like this. It's like, no, 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 that's not the case. Anarcho-capitalism, the whole point of natural law being objective is that it's always true who is the aggressor and who is the aggressed upon, right? But that is distinct. The law itself is distinct from the enforcement of the law. And this is a mistake a lot of objectivists make. This is why a lot of objectivists fucking hate the word anarchist, because they confuse anarchism with there being competition in what the law is. But that's not the case. There's competition in the actual enforcement of the law rather than in the actual law, because the law itself is objective. It's just the enforcement of it is done by a bunch of competing firms most efficiently.
Yeah, I can see your point with that. But I would press you to concede that at some level there must be some, I call it, I came up with this sort of two terms. There must be either collaboration or contradiction in entities, free associations. And if you do collaboration, then you get a universal sort of agreement to certain norms forming. And if you do contradiction, you get nation states essentially forming. Right. But if you're going to go with collaboration, that's fine. Just know that there will be by some means, there will be some legal order that will have to be universal, or at least somewhat universalized. And where that comes from could change, but there are lots of different legal orders where, who's making the laws and who's facilitating the agreements can change. I mean, we have that all the time in democracy.
I think I might have lost the point in there somewhere. What is just like the thesis statement of this argument?
Well, I just wanted to get you to agree that there'll be some universal binding law that is agreed upon.
Well, like, I think the law is objective, but I don't think there would necessarily be like, is it to do with when do we subject people to arbitration, whether they want to or not? Is that the
that's one example. I mean, I think that's one that we can go with.
In any given case, it would be either objectively legal or objectively illegal to subject that person to arbitration, and the market, it's going to make mistakes. Right, there will be, sometimes when they fucking pull a guy in, put him in a cage, but he didn't do anything wrong, right? And they would objectively be in the wrong for doing that. And they could face restitution, retribution, whatnot. And I think it's not necessarily a likely scenario that you'd have people being dragged to arbitration. I think it's more likely that, you'd be like, hey, I'm going to arbitration, and here's the date. And, if they don't show up, then the judge is more likely to side with you, because you did show up, and, you can make the argument, and be like, hey, here's all my bruises, here's the CCTV footage of him beating me up. And it's like, well, okay, yep, he's guilty, stamp. And then the assaulters, rights enforcement agency, because they agreed to the arbitration, they'd be like, well, we're not going to protect this guy from you anymore. You can go in and, retribute against him.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, but I guess my problem is I don't see where in that description there was a decision on when one is pulled into an arbitration. Like, what's the threshold?
Well, that would be done on the market. It might be the case that private courts find it, that there is sometimes when you just pull people into arbitration against their will. I don't know whether that would be the case, but I could tell you whether it be illegal or illegal. It would be legal if they, did a similar crime and this is retribution, but it would be illegal otherwise. So that's all I can only tell you whether it be legal or illegal. I can't tell you whether it would happen. It might happen sometimes on private courts. Who knows? That's the whole point of having a market, is that I can't give you all the answers of how to organize
Hmm.
this thing. That's why I
I
need a
I get
market to do
that.
it.
I get that. So when someone who's like my friend the mutualist who I argued with a while ago maybe says that, okay, so we're living in a free society. We have freedom of association, and we have freedom, in who we choose as arbiters. What if as our arbiter we have a mutualist, right? What if everyone happens to be, and that's the majority of people. What if there's a Ancap society where the majority of people and the big players, so to speak, have this preference for mutualists, uh, like ideals.
Well, that'll be absolutely fine because mutualism isn't distinct at all from anarcho-capitalism in terms of the legal theory. Well, I mean, I suppose anarcho-capitalism has a slightly more developed legal theory, but it's basically the same. Rothbard just refined what Proudhon did.
Interesting. I mean, I read some of Proudhon, although I'm not going to act like I'm someone who's able to retain a bunch of what I read. So I'm less, confident in being like Proudhon said this and Proudhon said that. But he did express some attitudes that I did find distinctly unique from a capitalist perspective. For example, at one point I recall uh, him speaking about different types of conceptions of property and saying, do we consider property to be something that is simply held by people along the lines of
Hmm.
this
I
indefinitely, or do we see it as
I
seats in a stadium?
I
Maybe you're
have
familiar with
this
that.
exact quote on my computer somewhere.
Oh,
Uh, Basically, there's a big misconception around what Proudhon means by property, and it's a misconception that is wildly pushed by communists and the like, because they want to pretend that Proudhon is some hater of private property. When Proudhon says things like property is theft, which he actually regretted saying on his deathbed, and you can read his deathbed last words. Basically, and he says this explicitly when responding to Monsieur Blanqui, who was a critic of his, who said, "Why are you saying property is theft?" And he said, "Well, when I talk about property, there's a bit of a synonymy here. Um, what does it mean to have a property in something? It's because there is a mass of abuses. We all agree on this in property. And when he's speaking about that, he's speaking about the aristocracy at the time. They had what was being called property, and they were abusing this. They were basically taking it from the peasants. And he was saying, well, we can either call that property or we can call it something else. Either property is the just ownership over something or it's just possession, right? And he was
mm,
saying, basically, it's just an ontological difference, just a difference in definitions. We're at the point here where Rothbard has said, well, property, that is the actual just ownership over it, and unjust ownership is just possession or something else. Whereas Proudhon said, no, property is the unjust possession of stuff. It's the stuff that the aristocracy has, rather than what the
mm.
peasants have.
I think his point was rather that not that property was always like that, but rather that it can be, and maybe one of the conditions that it
Yeah,
can
yeah, yeah.
be is when it's the aristocratic property, old feudal property.
Like, basically, when the words have almost flipped, right? When Proudhon speaks of property, that's what I call possession. I just say, well, you possess something. That's just when you have it.
Mm,
It might be that you justly have it, or it might be that you don't justly have it. It's unknown just in the fact of possession. Whereas when you have a property in something, that means you are the actual just owner of that thing. Whereas Proudhon was, it was very early days, so the definitions were still being worked out. What is the best way to denote this thing?
hmm Yeah, I can definitely see that, but you can see how maybe I would interpret that as sort of in my way of I have my principle of autonomy. I've spoken about this. You don't really like it when I talk about this, but I'll do it again. Um, and when I would say something like, you know, property can be an insurer of autonomy, but it can also restrict autonomy in certain ways. And then maybe you and I would disagree on, when it's restricting autonomy versus when it's, granting autonomy, right?
Like, I feel like it's just very vague what it means to restrict or to not restrict autonomy. This is why I am like very precise in having a praxeologic framework for natural law, and there are other ANCAPs. Anglo Libertarian is one of them, who has a very different uh, way of talking about natural law theory. For Anglo, he talks about it in terms of the nature of man in like an Aristotelian sense, right? Where it's like, and Rothbard was the same. So this is not like me saying this is a bad way of doing things or anything like that, because Rothbard talked about it this way. But I think it's just better to have a precise definition of what the natural law is, where your rights actually come from. And praxeology provides us a very, very precise way of talking about these things. So that's why I'm very headstrong on
Hmm.
using praxeology and conflict avoidance. And I think Hopper's the same.
Yeah, I'm probably not going to be with you on that. I have my own way of doing it, and yes, it's not clear entirely, but it still gives me what I want out of society, and it gives me something to advocate for, to make, at least to actualize what I want for society and for myself, right?
Hmm.
And we're probably just going to disagree on that, I guess. When I say autonomy, I'm usually referring to will actualization. So we can speak of things like, your wants, and your ability to, you know, actually actualize those wants, right? And property would be conceived of as in my mind as being sometimes detrimental when it stands in the way of those wants without any other reason other than it existing as property. Um, right. I think that it requires more to justify the property just other than, it was homesteaded, it was first possessed, and all this type of stuff.
Um, well, I think this kind of touches on something I was trying to get at earlier with mutual profit. Do you think like the property of the factory owner is infringing in some way on the factory workers because they don't own
In
their means of
some way
production?
it is, in some way it isn't, is what I'll say. In
So
some
like,
in some way it is, in some way it isn't.
do you get what I mean when I say mutual profit then?
Yeah, I mean, the factory owner receives profit and the laborer receives a wage, and they both get something.
I,
Is
I
probably what you're referring to.
I don't think it's not just that they both get something; they both profit. See, like this is the great advancement that Menger brought us with subjectivist economics. It's not profit isn't just when you get money for something. Profit is subjective. It's an increase in your perception of value, right? So, this is the example I always use. There's a hot dog vendor selling hot dogs for $5 a piece, right? I go up and I trade him $5 for one of his hot dogs. The classical economist would say, well, the hot dog vendor profited however much money he gained on having to, subtracting $5, however much it cost him to make the hot dog. It's no, no, no. That would be taking a cardinal view on value. Instead, the post-subjectivist economics, we say, well, okay, right. So we have it just that we both profited. because I must have valued the hot dog more than the $5, or else I wouldn't have traded it. And simultaneously, the hot dog vendor must have valued the $5 more than the hot dog, or else he wouldn't have traded it. So you are
Hmm.
rearranging the property to those who value it more. Because I valued the hot dog more than $5. So I profited. I attained a higher valued good from my own perspective. So did the hot dog vendor. We both profit there.
Mhm.
The same thing happens
Yeah,
in
I
every
can.
trade, every voluntary trade, that is. So if the workers
Mm,
voluntarily say, yes, I want to work in this factory, I prefer working here to not working here, it must be the case that they are making psychic profit from that decision, or else they wouldn't have chose it. They wouldn't have agreed to work there.
yeah, I don't. I think that's something that makes sense when you look at two equal parties engaging in a voluntary transaction without any external factors. But we don't live in that type of scenario with any commodity. Quite frankly, um,
I mean,
such as, for example, food. If people want to live, they have to purchase food. Now, I'm not making a case for we should, you know, decommodify food and stuff, but I'm not like that. I'm much more market orientated than that. But in certain relations, the relationship is so personal that I think that it warrants, in my estimation, the the reduction of any benefit in that. I mean, for an average worker, yes, they have some choice in their field, and maybe they work their something that they enjoy, but they still must work at a place under some rule. And yes, there is a level of consent in that. I'm not arguing against that. Um, but they do it because you have to, because that's the mode of production that we exist in. That's the nature of production is a human need. Someone has to do work, right?
right, but this is like, that is, you're basically discussing why they profit. But like the fact is that they still do profit because they prefer living to not living. So they profit in acquiring a job because they think that would make them
Mhm.
live, whereas they wouldn't otherwise. It's all still subjective. They still win out by going that route than another route.
Yeah, I mean, they get something out of it, but it wouldn't be maximizing their will actualization unless they got everything.
Like not everybody
Right?
can
So
get
you see where I
everything.
diverge.
Not
You
everybody
see
can
where I
get
diverge.
everything though, because like
That's true. I can see that in certain circumstances, but that's for other reasons, because I think at a point where we start decommodifying everything, it starts to negate its utility. But that's another topic. But I think in this specific context with production, I don't think it does that.
what do you think utility is?
Um, Are you asking me like utility as in what a utilitarian would say, or when I say utility
When you say
in
utility, like, because I have my own view on what utility is, it's the Austrian
mm,
view. What is utility to you?
yeah, so when I said utility just then with reference to maximizing autonomy, it was expressing that such and such had utility towards the end of maximizing autonomy, or at least in my
Oh, right,
estimation.
okay, yeah, yeah, I see. So it's like useful towards that thing.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I was thinking in a complete. Because basically, for the Austrian economist, when somebody speaks of utility, the Austrian thinks that they're talking about like well-being, welfare, stuff like that. Happiness, you could define it as, just
Yeah, I mean, there are levels of, yeah, it's kinda similar to that. I
just
mean, because
basically
will actualization would
what the
relate to that.
it's what the actor expects will improve his circumstances the most. So, and this is also an entirely subjective measure and incomparable between different people. So we couldn't compare the utility between me and you, and you couldn't add or subtract from utility because it's ordinal.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I agree to a certain extent. I'm not going to make choices for anyone. I think that if I advocated for a society where we made all sorts of minute choices for people, I would be unhappy living in that society. So I don't advocate for that. Right.
Yeah.
I just advocate for giving up a certain ability, that is to exploit people in a specific way, because
What do you mean by exploit people? Like, do you think the worker's being exploited by the capitalist?
not in any objective sense. I'll give you that, just so you know. I'm not one of those people who say it happens in any objective sense. But when we use the term exploitation, we can normally know what that refers to. It's simply another term for the surplus labor value, which is profit.
That's the thing, though. That's the thing, because that would be assuming an objective value, but value is entirely subjective, which is why I went over that whole tirade of mutual profit. Because I don't think there is value being like stolen or scraped off in any way here by the capitalist. The capitalist is providing a service to the worker who wants to, the worker has a higher time preference schedule than the
I don't
capitalist,
think you can
so he doesn't want to
conclude that
invest.
because I don't think you can conclude that because we're not looking at the society in a vacuum. We're not looking at a trade in a vacuum. It's in a context. In a context where production is a human need, because if no one bakes the bread or takes the trash into the
I,
the
I think it's a
landfill.
mistake. I think it's a mistake to speak of needs in economics. I don't think needs are really a properly well-defined thing. I think there's only wants. You only want things towards certain ends. I don't think you need to be precise what you mean by a need here.
Well, it's a need in the sense of, if production is not done socially, then socially there will be some level of suffering wrought.
Like again, I think suffering
And
is
it's a
still
need to
subjective,
avoid.
and you cannot know a priori that people would
Well, I can
experience,
know some things.
and you
Like
can because it
I
we
mean,
might.
I can be reasonably sure that people don't want to starve. I can be reasonably sure that people don't want to
That's what I mean.
die.
Reasonably sure isn't a priori knowledge. It could be the case either way. You know,
Yeah, true.
if it's the case that people want to arrange production with other people, then they can do that. And that's absolutely fine, right? But that's the point. They gain in doing that if they do it. They show that they gain in doing it. So, we have the capitalist who invests in capital. He basically reduces his present consumption so that he can have these capital goods and he can have more in the future. But the worker doesn't want to do this. The worker just wants the money now. They want to have to deal with this investment business. So their higher time preference is satisfied by the relationship with the capitalist who has a lower time preference. Both parties win out.
Both parties receive something, but the question I ask myself
And that thing is what they
that
most want. It's they
I
win out
don't
the
think you
most that they
can
could win.
conclude that.
You
I
can,
don't think you can conclude
because
that because
the worker didn't want to reduce their present consumption for the future in this act of investment. They didn't want to do that, and they showed that they didn't want to do this. Whereas the capitalists did want to do this. And so the capitalist's lower time preference intermingles with the worker's higher time preference. It's a marriage made in heaven.
most workers work to get the money that they receive in wages so that they can go out and purchase things and do the things that they want in their life.
Yeah. And they don't
Right.
want
But
to offset their present consumption of money
they don't
goods.
necessarily consent to the trade-off to that. They don't necessarily like the trade-off. Now
Well,
they do consent to it because it's the option there. It's the option that's presented to them.
But like they show that they like it more than not having that trade-off, right? They must like it more, or else they wouldn't do
Well,
it.
yeah, right. But that's true of a lot of different circumstances. Although, of course, you would say they're completely disanalogous. So, like, giving the robber money when they
Yeah,
point a
so
gun at you,
but
right?
that's the thing. That's under coercion. I don't think there's mutual
Yeah,
profit
I
in
know.
that, because
I get.
that's why I made sure to say that it's an involuntary trade. You have mutual profit. So it's when they're actually voluntarily choosing. That's when they're profiting from it.
Yeah, but you see that from my point of view, that's not the question that I asked. The question that I ask is, are the majority of people actualizing as much of their wills as they could? Do they have, and autonomy is a big part of that, right?
But
That's control over their day-to-day life. And if they're working in a institution, they have no control over that. Well, if they can have a little bit more control, that's a little bit more autonomy.
like, I still don't understand what it means to actualize will.
It's quite simple. It's just, I want to, I have a joystick in front of me. I want to tap the joystick, and I can tap the joystick. If I tap the joystick, that's a will actualized.
So it's like the attainment of ends, we could define it as.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Well, the worker definitely has it in their end that, well, it's more of a means, but the worker definitely shows that their end is more conducive to engaging that relationship than not.
Yeah, in a specific context.
And
If
that's
that
the context
context
that's
was
relevant.
removed, if we can provide them a different context where they have more autonomy, that would be preferable.
I mean, what do you mean by provide them? How would you go about this providing?
By having a different type of property that does not allow exploitation to occur.
But like, what would you actually physically do?
Well, first of all, the state would cease recognition of property that is used to exploit.
I mean, it already doesn't. It already doesn't recognize property rights. It engages in taxation.
Well, yeah. Well, that's because the state also asserts a level of ownership over everything, and so it can tax you on anything.
Yeah.
Right. The state and the current order of things has its own self-serving system of property that it puts into place. Right. And you and I both disagree with that. I'm highly against taxation myself as well. So I'm not really talking about taxes or anything. But in this specific circumstance, the state would simply cease to do a specific thing,
I would
which is
love that.
recognize.
I would
Yeah,
love.
which,
I would love if the
but you're not
state
gonna
ceased to
like
do
what
everything. If the state
I
just ceased
know,
everything they do, I would love that.
but you're not gonna like the thing that I think it should cease doing, which is recognition of property used to exploit. Right.
Like, I don't think they recognize property at all. I don't think they recognize that property currently.
Yeah, but currently they recognize a type of property which allows exploitation to occur in lots of different ways.
Maybe
Right.
maybe you could frame it as they recognize some positivist notion of property, but I think this is retarded.
I mean, I don't like what the state does either, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that the things that they enforce and call property are not actually property. I would just say it's a form of property I disagree
Like,
with, but I get where you're coming from.
I think property is a normative statement. When you say that you own something, you are making an actual claim that you have the just say over what happens to it in the event of a conflict.
Yeah, it'll be difficult for me to use that definition because I'm not used to doing it, but I'll try to. Right, I can understand what you mean by that. So there are certain norms right now that are created and upheld by the state, and one of those norms facilitates exploitation. I would say that a way that would give people more autonomy in their lives is if the state ceased recognizing the norm that they call property that when it's doing that, right? And it basically Me and my friend came up with a very specific way that we want to do this, but it's very long. Um, and I could not recite it in a way that would not sound very annoying to anyone watching this and to you. Right.
I guess I just don't understand what the state stopping recognition of something. I don't see what that does.
Well, in tandem with its ceasing recognition of something, it will also initiate recognition of another thing, which is the next step of this, which is instead of the claim of the exploiter, it would then recognize a claim of the exploited.
Okay, so what exactly is exploitation here?
Exploitation would be the using of property to detach one from the value of the product they produce. Value in this sense, meaning what it is valued by the public as.
I don't
And
think
mind you, all of these are provisional. I'm not making any claim about the
see
like
the problem is
objective nature.
I don't think the public can value something. I think only individuals can value things.
Individuals value things at different rates, but I think that I am within my good senses to say that I can say that it's relevant to consider a social value in specific contexts.
I mean,
And
what
I
does
think
that mean
it's relevant in
if
this
value is
context.
subjective, as in relative to the subject in question? How could it be that there's a social or collective value in any sort of sense?
It's what's embodied by the market price of a commodity. Right, so the price that people are willing
Well,
to purchase a commodity at
so like
generally.
the price, all the price is whatever the seller is willing to take for it. That's all it is. It's not reflective of value, right? That's the mistake that the classical economists make. They say, well, if the hot dog's being sold for $5, that is valued at $5. But no,
Yeah, I'm not
nobody
making a
nobody actually values it at that amount.
I'm not making a strong economic claim here. I'm actually a pluralist in how I can see in how I conceive of value and stuff like that. I think we can glean useful things from considering price as value, of considering all, all different things, considering it's subjective, right, in different contexts. But I don't know that much about economics, so I'll concede that to you.
Fair
But I'm
enough.
very specifically in this context saying that this is provisional and it refers to the products, the commodities price on the market to the general population. And now I concede wholly that that does not actually represent the actual value to, in an actual even social sense or to an given individual of that commodity. But I'm merely saying this provisionally um, as a means to an end.
What do you mean by saying something provisionally?
Well, I'm saying it provisionally, and what that means is that I'm saying it in a context of maybe a rule or a norm that doesn't necessarily reflect the the actual substance of something. So if the example that I gave was the detaching a laborer from the surplus value of the product on the market. Um, when I say that, and when I say it's provisional, what I mean is that I can say it and it can have meaning, even though it does not reflect necessarily the actual reality of the situation.
So, um, so it has meaning, but you're not
Yes, like
speaking
we
about
know what
the
each, yeah.
the reality of the situation.
Yeah, we know what each part of the statement refers to,
But like
and they
that's the thing.
refer to actual things,
I
but
don't
they
know,
don't.
because I don't think workers are exploited. I just don't think that. So unless we're precise in what it means to be exploited, you can say things provisionally all you want, but that's just we're not going to get anything intersubjective here if it's going to be just like, well, everyone knows what a horse is, right? It's well, like
Yeah,
I
so
don't know what exploitation is.
it's when a commodity is placed on the market and is sold for a given price, if some of that value goes to a property holder instead of to a producer.
I mean, value can't go places. I don't know what it means
Well,
for
I'm
value to
talking
go
about
somewhere.
money. I'm not using the term value. If I used value, I'm sorry. I don't mean value. It's just price. It's just the price that it's selling at.
So when you sell something, if that money goes towards a property owner instead of a producer, then it's exploitation.
Yeah, in a certain context. Like I said, I have a whole document that outlines this,
Like,
the specifics of that. Because I don't think it will be necessarily wrong for them to retain ownership of the property, but I do think that it will be wrong for them to give a disproportional representation to themselves in deciding what is done with that money that is sort of surplus money.
so is this like, well, it cost $3 to make this hot dog, but it's being sold for $5, and the capitalist takes that
Yeah.
surplus money. Like, I don't see how that's exploitative in any sense of the word. That just, you
Well, I mean,
know.
you can say it's not exploitative, but it happens. And
But
I'm
like
saying that it's
everybody agrees
bad.
to that situation. That's
Yes, but as I already explained, that we don't agree in a vacuum. There are contexts to which we make agreements. We're
but
not this
what does
ideal
the
sense of
context
two
have to do
people.
with anything though?
Well, if my goal is, as I said earlier, will actualization, and there's a certain norm in place in the society, that means that there will always be certain people whose actualization is, because of the context they're placed in, reduced, then obviously I'm going to run up against that norm. That norm is private property,
But
which
like
facilitates this exploitation.
we're
I'm
at
not
a,
making any
we're
grand claim about it being.
we're at a very big problem here because your definition of will actualization was also in this provisional sense. So like I can't actually pin you down to any actual opinion because it's all just provisional.
It's it's provisional, yes, in a sense, and everything is kind of provisional. I get what you mean when you say that. But the the initial statement that I made about exploitation was more provisional, I guess, than my claims about morality and will actualization. They're provisional in different senses, and I understand the confusion. I really understand the confusion, and I'm not doing the best at, communicating this because you probably understand there are multiple words that one can use to mean the same thing or to mean different things. I apologize if it's hard to follow.
Hmm.
So when I say that it's provisional, that I accept will actualization as utilitarian in how I advocate for society to be, I'm saying it's provisional in a similar sense because it does not actually reflect the real substance of like morality for me, which is just my preference. Um, and it serves some other end. Um, so it's similar in that sense,
Um,
I
well,
guess, if that clarifies anything.
not really. I don't know if we're gonna be able to get anything here. Unless you have anything else to do, I don't know if we can. I don't have any other topics in mind, but I don't think I can.
Yeah, I guess if you want to finish it up, we can. I will say I'm a little disappointed that we didn't, come to a common understanding, at least on where we were disagreeing on certain things. But I feel like there was some progress made by this, at least a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
I'm not like most leftists. I know that there's a lot of common talking points that you probably hear a lot. The exploitation occurs thing is probably a very common thing that you hear, but I'm not going to say that. The exploitation thing I did say, even if I said it provisionally, I'll concede that to you. But the common thing you might hear from leftists is that it's theft, right? It's theft when the capitalist, does the capitalist thing. I don't say that because I think that property is arbitrary and is part of moral preference.
When you say exploitation, I just picture a hunched over Richard Wolff every time.
Yeah, I like Richard Wolff a lot.
I hate him.
Although I disagree with him on a lot of small things. I tend to like Giannis Varoufakis, is that how you say his name? A little bit more than him. Although I don't agree with either completely. So yeah. If there's anything else you want to say,
I've not got anything else. It was great talking to you. If you have any contentions with me in the future, I guess I'll welcome you back on. Yeah,
sure.
it was fun.
And if you have contentions with me, just hit me up anytime.
All right, yeah, sure. I'll see you
end
later,
the
man.
stream. Peace.
Yeah, that was a fun debate. But yeah, there was a lot of chat earlier about Zulu, he's trolling you, trolling. I'll just clarify my position there. I don't give a shit if he was trolling or not. It's entirely irrelevant to the point of my debates. The point of my debates is simply to further my channel in order that I can more effectively do Isaiah's job in preaching anarcho-capitalism. So this was a 2 hours, 20 minutes debate. That's a lot of watch time. I've seen when I debate real long, I get a fuck ton of watch time. It's genuinely, the longer I debate, the bigger it gets. I can already see that this is way bigger, just based on the graph here, than the last debate I did, which was about 20 minutes, because the guy agreed with me really quick. So basically that's my incentive. My incentive is not to have only honest people on my channel, because then I'd never debate any socialists, because they're all dishonest. It's to simply get more content, as it were. But yeah, it's good to have you guys here. It was fun. I'll see you guys next time.